Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today. And in this programme we'll be asking, are we seeing the return of New Labour to influence our government and also to influence a possible future Labour government? And what does this mean for our country and our democracy? So in this programme I'm joined by Robin Benson. Great to see you, Robin, Christian commentator, together with Alistair Scott, the UK director of Joseph Storehouse. Robin, I'll start off with you. I mean, it's some interesting stories really have emerged, how key figures in New Labour are having a lot of influence on this Conservative government. We know that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown are also advising Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, which is extraordinary considering they're from the Labour Party, he's a Conservative. We've even seen, for example, Trisha Hewitt has been employed by Jeremy Hunt to sort out the NHS. They're saying if Labour wins, they're going to parachute David Miliband from New York back as a potential foreign minister again, as the Secretary of State for the Foreign Office to become a Foreign Affairs Minister. And again, the influence of Peter Mandelson, Alistair Campbell, Gordon Brown has been the guy that they want to be in charge of reforming the House of Lords. Are we seeing a return and influence of New Labour?
Yes.
Programme over.
That's it. Let's all go home. Yeah, I mean, it's a crazy situation. You know, we discussed it before we came on air. Who would have thought that these senior figures, and they're all guys and women that wield significant weight within the Labour Party, actually advising a Conservative government on how to get out of the mess that we're in at the moment, and, as you say, sowing the seeds effectively for Labour's campaign for the next general election in 2024. You know, if we have to wait that far for that to happen, it's astounding. You know, it really makes you wonder what has become of the Conservative Party. Not that, you know, not we want that politics that they be at each other's throats, but they're supposed to be different. Yeah. And yet we're seeing this more and more, this melding together of the two senior or the two longest running political parties coming together on basically a platform that they're both happy to agree with. Mm-hmm. It's bonkers.
Yeah. And Alistair, I mean, in politics, it's healthy to have ideological differences because, you know, it's the political ideology that gives the makeup and the identity of a political party, and with those ideas, they govern from that perspective. We know that, for example, when Tony Blair first emerged on the scene in the early 90s, he was a panelist in Question Time, and I remember watching the episode in 1993. He was asked, how do you describe yourself? And he described himself not as a kind of Labour, but he described himself as a Clintonite. And the fact that he borrowed political ideas from Clinton to steal some of the Conservative or Republican clothing, and then adopted that as kind of New Labour. So he knew that to win Middle England and to win the support of the middle classes, he came up with the slogan, tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. He wanted to show that the Labour Party removed its clause 4, its last links to Marxism, and then to say that how we embrace capitalism and the free market and business and be the party of business, for example. He then also realised as well that we need to steal the Conservatives' clothing regarding defence. So effectively, many would actually argue maybe he was actually a Conservative who was actually, you know, he won 3 general elections after all. But his return to kind of frontline politics and influence behind the scenes is a little bit troubling, knowing his kind of globalist credentials, everything to do with the World Economic Forum, everything to do with COVID-19, and also including kind of digital passports, digital currency. You know, you just dig a little bit and you realise that Tony Blair is pretty much thereabouts, and now he's advising Rishi Sunak. Doesn't this show the direction that Rishi Sunak is taking our nation and the country in a kind of move towards closer and closer globalism?
Yeah, I think the thing you saw for sure when New Labour came in and got the power, they were shifting because they'd lost so many elections over and over again. They had to shift from the left side, and they were middle They were definitely a middle party under Blair and Brown. It was the only way they had a resounding win, after all. But what you've seen also, then what happened after that was you got the Corbyn Labour Party, which was back to far left, and it's proved to be very unpopular again in general terms. It's a generalisation there. So they are, again, I find the Labour Party has moved to the middle. Conservative Party has moved to the middle, so it's in some ways it's surprising but not surprising that Rishi Sunak is looking to Tony Blair, who's a personality. I mean, that was his big thing, wasn't he? He was great in front of camera. He was like Obama is to the States. He was a great orator. People listened to him and thought, he had great ideas, and so for Rishi Sunak to be seeing the Brown and Blair team to be advising them for Conservative, what does it say? Does it say we're just going to have one party? The ones who are slightly further to the left are maybe the Green Party, the Liberal Party, and then you've got these two main parties who are sitting in the centre. And it's kind of frightening because, as you said earlier, you need to have the ideologies separate. Otherwise, we have no choice really. We're choosing from two parties who are more or less saying the same thing. I think also part of the reason for conservatism to move to that centre is because we've had the pandemic, and suddenly, if you weren't doing anything for the left people, you'd have been looked at as being some kind of ogres. So, looking at very often the Conservative Party is looking more like the caring people than the Labour Party has for a while. But yeah, it is a worrying development to see this Labour leaders of the past. I mean, can you imagine in America if suddenly Obama was giving counsel to the Republicans? It just wouldn't.
It wouldn't happen. And maybe he's running things behind the scenes with Joe Biden.
But certainly Blair's.
But that's a different program. Robin, I suppose you have to mention Gordon Brown here because he is seen as the intellectual heavyweight within the Labour Party, and was certainly the kind of brains behind the strong academic brains behind New Labour when he was Chancellor and had huge influence over the party. The fact that we have now the leader of the Labour Party, Kier Starmer, actually asking him to reform the House of Lords or even abolish it and change our constitution, which will be a huge political upheaval to do it. And if we recall, in the midst of the pandemic of 2020, Gordon Brown actually said the only answer to the COVID-19 global pandemic was a one world government. So why should we entrust Gordon Brown to reform our constitution and our House of Lords that has been there to scrutinise laws and legislations, and now be in charge of reforming it or demolishing the House of Lords altogether, and move us and tend to destroy more of our national institutions when he knows he's got a massive globalist agenda.
Yeah, but I think one of the things that's come out of the last nearly 3 years of all of the upheaval that we've gone through as a nation is that there's a high percentage of the general population who were already skeptical about politicians before the pandemic came along and are now thoroughly cheesed off with the political class. And don't trust them at all. And I think it's possible that Labour has done a little bit of sounding out across its network and come to the conclusion, actually there is out there in the country, amongst some of the voters, there actually is an appetite to see what is perceived by many people who don't understand the history for lots of different reasons, who don't understand the history behind the House of Lords. They see it as this place that is bloated. I mean, was it 830 members of the House of Lords? That's ridiculous. Totally ridiculous. This bloated upper chamber that is costing the taxpayer millions every year. And so it's time in Labour's thinking to play on that one area of distrust and make a radical change with all the other things that will ripple out from it. And I mean, Gordon Brown has been working on this policy for 2 years. He was given the idea in 2020 by Kier Starmer. So it's not something that has been pulled out of a hat. And yeah, I think they think there's an appetite for it. Whether there actually is when it comes to the bit, we'll only know when they actually present the policy as a general election policy and see how people respond.
And Alistair, does this also signify as well with the leadership of Kier Starmer that he kind of realises that with his own front bench of shadow ministers that really they're very weak, they're kind of intellectually lightweights, and so therefore he's now looking to the likes of Peter Mandelson, who's the architect of New Labour, together with Gordon Brown. I mean, there's even talk about them parachuting David Miliband, the former Foreign Secretary under Gordon Brown, to become the next Foreign Minister if the Labour Party win the next general election, and give him a safe seat so that he can become a minister, which indicates that there is something going on behind the scenes, because these are all globalists. They have a globalist ambition, and of course what we're seeing now is we're moving closer and closer to the new digital age, where we're heading towards a cashless society, which means less individual control and sovereignty and more state power, is that they can have more control over our lives and the direction that we take personally, but also the direction that our government goes in as well. So is it concerning that Kier Starmer and his team don't have the intellectual capacity to actually produce a strong functioning government, and this is why they're turning to New Labour, who they saw was successful under Tony Blair?
Yeah, and they are well-known names. I mean, the thing with the Labour Party is they're inexperienced. I mean, we have a similar problem with the Conservative Party. They're an inexperienced bunch on the cabinet. So bringing in names which are household names, I mean, most people of my age and a little bit below will know the names of Blair and Miliband and Brown, coming in as kind of almost being mature and well versed in politics and reliable, because as we just heard, you know, people are very skeptical about our present politicians, and it doesn't matter which party they're on, because people think whatever they say, you can't trust their word, that it doesn't come to pass. So sometimes, you know, it's the green grass, isn't it? Looking greener when you look backwards, and times are always better when you look backwards. And they tend to forget the mistakes or the bad parts of previous government. So, yeah, it's a worrying situation. But you talked about this. It's the globalism, which is worldwide. That is the influence. It influences most of the cabinet and the Conservative, and it's influencing most of the leading potential cabinet of the Labour Party, particularly Kier Starmer. And if you bring back Tony Blair, Brown, and Miliband, they are definitely on that side of the fence. And if you get into that, you know, we've come out of Europe, and we're going to get into a bigger hole with the globalist situation. So yeah, it's a tough time, and we need to have our eyes open, and as believers, we need to be praying more and more that things would be exposed. Because we don't want to walk into something that's going to cause us even more problems long term.
Yeah, and Robin, thankfully, you know, we haven't seen that John Prescott has been invited back to play a major role in a new Labour-led Kier Starmer government. So, you know, we have to be, there's an element of grace here. But on a more serious note, though, we know that Tony Blair won a kind of landslide victory in 1997, and then was, I think, re-elected, was it in 91? And then again in 2005. But he had the country was pretty wealthy and well off. And, you know, the Labour Party missed the historic opportunity of reforming the welfare state, which they could have done. He could have gone down as a great reforming Prime Minister. He didn't. I think he took the advice of, again, his mentor, Bill Clinton, was give the impression of change, but don't actually change anything, because it's going to create more political problems for you. So he didn't really do anything. Wasted huge amounts of our nation's resources in kind of foreign wars and campaigns. I think he was involved the British Army was involved in more military conflicts under Tony Blair than any other previous Prime Minister. Of course, he then also wanted to for us to accept the euro, and it was only by God's grace that we didn't, and Gordon Brown opposed that because he had complete control of the Treasury. And of course then he's going to be remembered for the war in Iraq in 2003. So, you know, as it comes to light and as we get closer to the general election and closer that we see the more of the New Labour influence over Kier Starmer and the Labour Party, you know, will the British people say, enough's enough, we had them in the 90s, we don't want them back?
I don't think so. I don't think the British people think that way. We're too short term. We're more worried about the next gas bill at the moment, the next electricity bill, this week's food bill. You know, and if you've got a Labour government or a potential Labour government campaigning to sort out these problems that we have, that actually, in one sense, Rishi Sunak is responsible for, because he was the Chancellor that spent multiple billions during the pandemic, that has brought us to where we are now, amongst other things. I mean, it's a global issue too, but within the confines of the UK, he's highly responsible for where we are. And if Labour can play into that and into the short-termism that seems to, and the immediate gratification that has become part and parcel of Western society, you know, not least our own here in the UK, I think there will be a sizable proportion of the population will buy into it because they'll see it as relief, potential relief from the mess that Boris, Liz and co and Rishi have brought us to. So in some senses, we are ripe for change. Even if it's just all on paper, it's all hot air, the idea of, oh, for goodness sake, let's just get rid of this shower of conservatives who are not conservative at all, and let's give Labour a chance to see if they can fix it. Whether they can or not is another issue, but that's the mentality. I mean, we have the same situation in the States.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
You give them a try, it doesn't really work, okay, we'll give the other guys a try now.
Yeah, and on that note, you know, I mean, if and it's more likely the case that Kier Starmer will win the next general election and that the Labour Party will form a next government. But having said that, they still got to overturn an 70 plus seat majority, which is huge in kind of politics to be able to do that. So even if they did win the election, they could probably only win it with a kind of small majority. Considering that the country is near enough bankrupt and there's not enough money for big welfare projects, how is Kier Starmer going to be able to generate the wealth? Also knowing that if he then borrows heavily, the same thing's going to happen to him as it happened to Liz Truss. The markets turn on him. He's under so much pressure and have to resign. And also waiting in the wings really is the far left. The Corbynistas still in the party, still have influence in the Labour Party. And, you know, he's done well to stamp out the issues of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. But if anything happens to him, then of course we could have the Corbynistas so close to power and influence within government.
Back in, yeah. And I mean, we've also seen the kind of unionist uprising in the recent months. But as Robin was saying, you know, I think the general public and the media are feeding the public at the moment with well, you've had 12 years in how many? Is it 12 years since 2010, wasn't it?
Yeah, the coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberals.
And look at the mess we're in, you know, and so the thinking is like Robin just said. People think, well, they've tried and nothing's worked. Let's try somebody else now. But the thing with the Labour Party and Kier Starmer, he's like playing a poker game and not showing his cards. You know, it's very easy. I've always said this. It's very easy to be a critical opponent when you're not in control. And you don't even offer solutions. You just say, this is rubbish. Look at the results. Look at the results. It's bad. But what are your solutions? And until he plays his hand, and hopefully then the nation, the general public, will begin to look at it a little bit more seriously. It's the same thing that's going on in Scotland. In the Scottish, it's a different subject completely, but it's promises of better times. But how are you going to finance it? You know, I could promise £1 million to everyone in Rusper Village where I live.
No, they'll be knocking on your door now.
That was just I'm not, but I can't do it. But it's easy to make promises you can't keep, and I think it's time at some point in the next coming months, the Labour Party have to play their hand and show how they're going to pay for the solutions they're talking about. Because as you just said, the nation's bankrupt, and we have to borrow. We have to borrow just to get out of the debt of the last 5 years or 3 years of pandemic and so on. Yep. So it's tough.
So Robin, just reflecting on what we've said and the strong possible return and influence of New Labour, but isn't our politics broken? That really and it was the Labour Party under Tony Blair that really signified this breakdown of relations between the electorate and the government, as less and less people trusted government institutions, particularly the kind of lies that were formed or justified for the liberation of Iraq under Saddam's regime. I personally believe that the motives to actually remove Saddam Hussein were right, but I didn't believe in the evidence that Tony Blair was presenting to do it, his agenda as well, wanting to be crowned king of the left, and then for George W. Bush then to push forward with the peace process to create a Palestinian state so he could use that as leverage to become the first elected president of the EU, which was his ambition back in the early part of the 2000s. So whoever wins, whether the Conservatives stay in power or whether New Labour wins, our politics is fundamentally broken, isn't it? Because there's a lack of trust, there's a lack of honesty, there's a lack of transparency. Our elected representatives no longer serve the national interest. They're serving kind of the elites. They're pushing our nation further into a kind of globalist agenda. So therefore the interests of our nation are being ignored. There's no proper dealing with migration, which is a massive problem of why so many Labour Party supporters voted for the Red Wall Conservatives in the last general election. And there's no clear ideological differences from any of the major parties in Westminster. And as Christians, that's extremely discouraging, but also knowing how do we vote the next election?
Yes, I think you're right that the political system is broken. But maybe the fact that we're talking that way is part of media, social media, highlighting the deficiencies, the lies, the deceptions. Maybe politics has been broken for a long time. Yeah. But actually, because of the world that we live in today, it gets blasted out on all of these different platforms, and people are much more aware of it than they were. And therefore, we're actually living with a further consequence of our technical digital age, that people have lost trust. But people probably would have lost trust a lot earlier if they knew some of the stuff that was going on, prior to Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher and all the rest of it. So it's a ripple effect of certain things going on in wider society. And I agree with you. It is discouraging, and I honestly don't know how you fix it. We can pray, which we should do, and I agree with Alistair. But sometimes I wonder if we're actually praying, and I don't have an answer for this, but I wonder if we're actually praying along the line of what God is actually doing. Because there are prophecies that have been given, and I know in last week's programme, the prophecy that Lance Lambert gave many years ago was referred to by the Reverend Mark Whedon. And we see that unfolding in front of our eyes.
Absolutely.
And that prophecy actually speaks about God breaking Britain in order to try and bring it back to himself. But that's not a done deal. That's not a foregone conclusion. That only will come about if a broken Britain turns to the Lord. If they don't, broken Britain will remain broken Britain and become more broken. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Because that too is a ripple effect. God is not, he has given the warning, But he's not obliged to fix it just for the sake of fixing it. He'll fix it if people cry out to him and turn to him. And if they don't, then we may have to live. I don't want to be a prophet of doom, okay, but we may have to live with the consequences of this brokenness for a long time. I hope not, but that's a possibility. And it's one line of thinking that we as believers in Jesus need to take into account when we come to God in intercessory prayer. What is God actually doing? Why is he allowing this chain of events to unfold in front of our eyes? What is he trying to communicate that we as members of the body of Jesus are not hearing? And therefore we're not actually praying in line with what he's trying to do, what he's trying to say. It's a great challenge to all of us, who follow the Lord.
No, absolutely, and care about our nation as
Yes.
well, and the future direction it goes in. I mean, if you look at the direction, particularly that Rishi Sunak is taking, when we're down to less than 3 minutes of programme, Alistair, is that he's nowhere near under any level of the same scrutiny that, for example, Liz Truss. I mean, the scrutiny under her was just, I've never seen anything like it. The same pretty much with our previous Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, as well. Massive media scrutiny. Every single mistake highlighted massively. The same thing that happened to Trump. Every word that he said was scrutinised. Every action was scrutinised to the massive degree. I mean, the BBC, for example, when Trump was in power, every single day they had a negative news story on him. Now, when do they see a negative news story on Joe Biden? They don't, despite the fact that he struggles to put 2 or 3 sentences together. He's not with it, and he's only half there in office, and he's considered the world's most powerful man. So I'm saying is, what influence is the media having also in pushing this agenda, which is enabling Rishi Sunak, enabling New Labour to have influences over our government and policy and to set the agenda, because there's no scrutiny on behalf of our media, which is its job to keep our politicians in check, to defend our democracy and freedom.
Well, we were talking about this before the programme, that politics at the moment has gone very quiet. I mean, there's a reason for it. There's a World Cup going on, and that seems to be the #1 headline in most news programmes. But you're right. When you see just how recently Liz Truss was really attacked, and she came into the Premiership or Prime Minister role at a time when the Queen died and everything was going on, and yet they were attack. But they certainly are laying off Rishi, and he's got the time to settle in.
Absolutely. So Alistair and Robin, thank you so much for being my guest for this week's Politics Day, and thank you for obviously giving all our viewers and myself something to think about, certainly how we should pray regarding the direction our government takes and what God is doing in our nation. So I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today, where we're seeing the influence of New Labour, not only in the Labour Party, but also now with Rishi Sunak's government, which is a Conservative government, and their globalist ideas. So again, we need to be on our knees. We need to be praying for our government and our nation at this critical time in this nation's history. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.